So good afternoon, everyone. I would like just to thank the person of Professor Angela for having me here today and for arranging this talk. So we could talk a little bit on women's rights in Brazil, focusing on setbacks and future perspectives, particularly on reproductive rights and the period that Brazil went through during Bolsonaro's mandate as a president of Brazil. So thank you very much for having me here. And if you have any doubts or any points you wish to focus on a little bit later, just right now and then we can discuss it. So to start, I would like to come back a little bit and explain why did we have that scenario concerning Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's entrance within Brazilian politics. And for that, I must say that Brazil is a patriarchal society. So here, of course, this data is in Portuguese. I will tell you what it is, but for you to have an idea, even though more than half of our population is formed by women, so we have 51% of the Brazilian population of women, we do not have much representation in politics of women. For you to have an idea, these parts in red are the percentage of women being candidates in the last election in Brazil back in 2022. So it is quite frustrating to see from 2014 to 2020 how we did not advance in terms of having women participating into politics. And this, of course, gets a little bit, yeah, that's it. So this becomes a huge problem when it comes to passing legislation and to approving bills that relate to women's rights. So this is something that I would like also to say that, for instance, even not in national political sphere, we do have in municipal elections also a very short participation of women. So this creates a problem within Brazil, because then who can discuss about women's body is actually men. So this is something that we have to take into consideration before we talk about Bolsonaro a little bit. Sure. So then we have to take into consideration, for instance, that we have been trying to change our political arena within Brazil. For instance, when it comes to some proposals, we have a constitutional amendment number 111 that was enacted in 2021 that was trying to actually get more women to participate into politics. This constitutional amendment tried to get more resources for parties who had more participation of women within the party. So as more you have women as a candidate for your party, you get more funding for the elections. This is because in Brazil, elections are publicly funded. They are not something that has private, for instance, funding or anything like that. For you to have an idea, this, of course, constitutional amendment added by another constitutional amendment, number 117, made we have more women being candidates, but that didn't reflect into election. Although we had more candidates, we did not elect them. So it's a bit flawed, our system, when it comes to women in participating into politics. So this is an idea for you to have the position of Brazil in political women participation in political arena. Brazil holds the 145th position in the world. So this is very bad when it comes to having people representing and talking about women's bodies and women's rights. Well, we have been having change, for instance, in 2021, considering that political violence is also some sort of violence that women can suffer within the political arena, recognizing, for instance, this as a criminal law in order for women to be protected when they come into the scenario of politics, right? When they become congressmen, so they are protected and not being, for instance, the target of any sorts of aggression that normally it is found in Brazil. Nevertheless, this is a picture of Marielle Franco. She was killed 5 years ago, and nobody knows, for instance, who killed her, despite minor connections to the former president of Brazil. So still, we have some steps to be taken, but these are positive. This is a positive side of Brazil. But we have to talk about now the negative side and how Bolsonaro actually made things worse for women in general in Brazil, and specifically concerning reproductive and women's rights. To get that, I would like to show you now a picture of Brazil within Lula's mandate. He entered into office now in January 2023. And that's a picture of all the ministers from Bolsonaro's government when he entered into office in 2019. As you can see, there are only 2 women as ministers in Brazil and during Bolsonaro's mandate, while in Lula's government now we have 11 women participating into this high part of political arena within the country. So it is very interesting to note the difference between governments. We have a huge difference when it comes to Bolsonaro and Lula currently. And I should take into consideration that during Bolsonaro's mandate, we had, of course, 2 women. Teresa Cristina, she was the Ministry of Agriculture, but worstly is Damares Alves, Ministry of Human Rights and Women Affairs within Brazil. For you to have an idea, one of her talks and one of her most famous talks is that boys should wear blue and girls should wear pink. So for you to have an idea, this is the kind of people there were in front of Brazil from 2019 until 2022. So during this scenario, we have to take into consideration, okay, so despite the fact that we had those advancements into having more women participating into politics, nevertheless, it did not turn into reality. And still recognizing political violence as something that we should fight against, we had major setbacks when it comes to women's rights. Bolsonaro was not only president, right? Before being president, he was a congressman representing the state of Rio de Janeiro since 1991. So he has been into the political arena in Brazil for quite a long time. So it's not something that from overnight we had him become president. It's something that he was already into this political arena and was advancing or trying to advance some far-right strategies against at least women and their rights. For you to have an idea, he has been called, of course, not only misogynist, but sexist and always undermining women, even if they are Black or white. That quote, for instance, in the red part, he said he would never rape another congresswoman because she didn't deserve to. This was a line he said during one of his participations in Congress as a congressman, directed to another fellow congressman, congresswoman in that case. So this is something for you to have an idea. So he had a past. Everybody knew who they were voting for when it comes to Bolsonaro. It's not something that overnight he became anti-feminist or anti-women. In addition, he and his sons always praised crimes committed against women during the dictatorship within Brazil. For instance, here there's a line of his son, Eduardo Bolsonaro, that was almost appointed ambassador for Brazil to the United States, but United States under the table said they wouldn't accept his name. So this talk went finished right over, but this talk is very bad because he said he was feeling sorry for a snake that was used to torture a journalist in Brazil called Miriam Leitão during the dictatorship. So he was feeling sorry for the snake, not for Miriam Leitão, for instance. So it's something about his family and something about how they react towards women. This is something that everybody knew before he entered into office as a president. Right, so let's talk about a few setbacks we had during his presidential mandate. The first of them was in October 2021, when the Menstrual Health Protection and Promotion Program was sanctioned. Bolsonaro vetoed the heart of the project. This project was supposed to have pads distributed for women that are in vulnerable situation, not only those who live on streets, but also those who are imprisoned. And this would be a very interesting project when it comes to combating a menstrual vulnerability. He vetoed the distribution of pads. That was the heart of the project, and he passed everything but the distribution of pads. So this is something that we considered to be not good when it comes to protecting the rights of women. We should say that in Brazil, every time a president vetoes a part of the project, this veto can be overturned by the Congress. And this veto was indeed overturned by the Congress in March 2022. But still, there were no provisions regarding who was responsible for having these pads distributed to the population. And this pads distribution now, during Lula's presidency, was said to be something that is the responsibility of the healthcare program that we have, the public health care program in Brazil. So this is something very important because we're talking about dignity, we're talking about protecting women's rights when it comes to menstrual protection. Right. Now we are talking about abortion. Abortion is also another problem that we had during Bolsonaro's presidency, because he adopted the Ministry of Human Rights from Damaris Alves, that lady that said that boys wear blue and girls wear pink, if you paid attention. She passed an order number 2282 that was later transformed into order 2561, talking about procedures regarding the termination of pregnancy in cases provided for by law, such as, for instance, in rape cases. Rape cases in Brazil, one can get an abortion. And this order said that doctors should notify the police when they had a suspicion that a woman was getting an abortion in any cases. So even if it was rape, or even if it presented some sort of health issue for the life of the mother, or some threat to the life of the mother, which is also prescribed by Brazilian law that one could terminate pregnancy, or other cases, or even taking medication in order to fulfill an abortion, the doctor should notify the police. So there were no more secrets between patient and doctor, because this order obliged the doctors to notify the police. So this is quite bad, because when it comes to terminating pregnancy, of course, these women would feel threatened, and not only threatened, but also maybe publicly embarrassed to go after some sort of health care, or to finding a doctor that could provide her any treatment. So this was something that was also not considered a very good scenario for women's rights during Bolsonaro's mandate. Because of that, I shall show you some of the problems that we have concerning, for instance, rape victims in Brazil. And since 2018, we have some data regarding this crime published by the public health care system within Brazil, that says that there's an average of 180 rapes registered per day in Brazil. An estimated notification of this crime is only of 10%. So we would suggest that these numbers are more than higher than that, more than doubled, I would say. And for you to have an idea, that picture that I'm showing you, it says rich women can pay, poor women die, but all of them suffer. because of this crime and because of the access to abortion, for instance, on those cases. If you come to the numbers, 21,000 girls between 10 and 14 years old are victims of sexual violence within Brazil. And they underwent childbirth, so they did not go through any sort of abortion. And we're talking about girls from 10 to 14 years old. There are only 65 services available throughout the country for legal abortion. We have 26 state and 1 federal district. So maybe the number is like 2 per state, 2 services per state, normally in the capital city. But even though they're normally provided for in the capital city, it is very expensive for people within the countryside to go to the capital cities to have this sort of services provided for them. So this is also a problem when it comes to having access to those services, abortion services. And even worse when it comes to that order that was passed in 2021. Besides, only 7 to 15% of women have access to legal abortion, as I just mentioned. Those that have, maybe they can pay, they will have access. Those that can't will normally not have access to any sort of abortion. And more than 500,000 abortions are performed per year in Brazil, with a 67% of women having children, even when it comes to the crime of rape. So this is the scenario of Brazil. So we have huge percentages of this crime. And still they passed an order saying that every time a woman should get one abortion, this woman, for instance, would have to, or would have her name notified to the police by the doctor if she did so. And then we have 2 sort of popular cases that have happened in Brazil. The first of them is that Ministry of Human Rights, Damares Alves, the one that I told you about, the girls were pink, boys were blue one. She acted to stop an abortion from a 10-year-old girl in Brazil in 2020. This girl had her name published in papers. Her family was constrained by those who are anti-abortion, and they even went to the doors of the hospital protesting for saving the life of the baby and impeding her to have a legal abortion. So she had to be removed from that hospital, taken to another place in another state to undergo this safe abortion procedure. But all of this was noticed, or it was published within all the major televisions and papers within Brazil. So that was the Ministry of Human Rights, for instance. And then another case that was even more, I would say, worse, is a judge in Santa Catarina state, which is the 2nd state in the south of Brazil. She encouraged a girl of 11 years old, raped, to give up abortion. After being notified by the police, after undergoing this criminal investigation, she wanted still to have an abortion, and she filed a suit in order to get one. And the judge that was carrying on that hearing, she showed a video for the girl showing that, oh, this is your baby, see the heartbeat, in order to persuade her not to have an abortion within the country. So this happened, for instance, in 2022. So these are the kind of cases we have had as a direct impact from those orders that were passed in Brazil in the beginning of Bolsonaro's mandate. We have had a reaction of the UN Committee for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women because of that. That was requested in November, that Brazil was requested in November 2020 to provide explanations on the guarantee of safe abortion, as well as a continuous access to modern contraceptive methods for the prevention of unwanted pregnancies. I should say that the first part, it was related to those orders that were passed, but Brazil did not respond to the UN Committee on the elimination of discrimination against women. on that part, because Brazil had the position that life should be preserved and no abortions should be carried out during Bolsonaro's mandate. But the second part here talks about modern contraceptive methods for prevention of pregnancy. And what does it mean? Why did the UN committee ask Brazil also to clarify his methods concerning that? Because there were bills being proposed by congressmen trying to first ban contraceptives such as IUD and the morning after pill, such as Bill 261 of 2019, and also the implementation of a rape support program that would actually entail the paying of a minimum wage for those mothers who have who gave up abortion in order to have their children. So, okay, if you do not go through abortion, you might get paid a minimum wage until this kid becomes or turns 18 years old. And this is especially interesting for women in vulnerable situation, because then they would have at least a minimum wage paid for at least 18 years. So this would mean that they would be maybe forced to go through the pregnancy, even though they were raped. So because of these programs, these bills that were being proposed, the UN committee also requested Brazil to address that. And Brazil did not address. Brazil did not respond, the UN committee, to the elimination of discrimination against women. But still, I should say that we had this week a very interesting change in our Superior Court of Justice. Brazil, we have a Superior Court of Justice and a Supreme Court. Supreme Court hears cases concerning the Constitution, and Superior Court of Justice hears cases regarding federal laws. And the Superior Court of Justice, for the first time, recognized, for instance, that the doctor could not tell the police to investigate a case when it comes to a rape victim. So this is what this news says, that the Superior Court of Justice says the police cannot be involved in those cases because of the secrecy between doctor and patient, going against those orders that were approved during Bolsonaro's mandate. But this was this week, because before that, we have only had one state tribunal that would actually say that this right to privacy should be upheld, which was the state of São Paulo. All the other 25 states and the federal district were of the opinion that the secrecy could be open because of those orders that were passed during Bolsonaro's mandate. So for the first time now, the Superior Court of Justice said no, privacy should be upheld. So this is very interesting. Nevertheless, they did not go into the legalization of abortion in Brazil, which was a specific point in all of those cases that should have had the Superior Court of Justice attention. And why did they not address this part of the legalization of abortion in Brazil? Because specifically, there is a suit in the Supreme Court, number 442, which talks about the liberalization of abortion in Brazil. It questions the impossibility of getting abortions in Brazil. Therefore, this case is still pending. And because it is still pending, the Superior Court of Justice decided not to touch on that point, because it would be a constitutional matter, and then the Supreme Court should be the one to address that. But for you to have an idea, this is a picture of the movement to legalize abortion in Brazil in order to have this constitutional right, at least for prescribed for within the country, which now is only for cases, as I mentioned, of rape and cases where the life of the mother is threatened. At the international level, I must say that Brazil joined the Geneva Consensus on the women's health and strengthening of the family. This consensus was proposed by Donald Trump, and it is formed by 34 countries. I must say that now, January 2023, Brazil left the consensus. So this is a good point, But this was a very bad position for Brazil. This is Damares Alves, and this is the former Ministers of Foreign Affairs, Ernesto Araújo, when they decided to join this Geneva Consensus. This Geneva Consensus is basically trying to say that we should get anti-abortion practices within these countries. And not only that, we should fight for the right of the family in regard to family being constituted only for men and women, for instance. So this would actually be a very huge step back in Brazil when it comes to the LGBTQIA plus community, for instance, that have been prescribed for or had their rights prescribed for in the country, not only because of regional agreements, but also because of international agreements. So despite of this setback for the past 4 years, 2023, Brazil left this consensus. Right, talking about another point that we must address, it's in vitro fertilization, IVF. IVF is a practice that has been growing in Brazil. We had minor reductions in the number of people going through IVF during the pandemic, of course, because of the measures of social distancing and everything. Nevertheless, in Brazil, there are almost 43,000 babies being born through IVF per year. So this has been a growing mark within the country. For instance, Brazilian law allows IVF for any type of family. So imagine Brazil participating in that consensus. It would be a step back when it comes even to IVF, because then the type of family would matter if one had to go through the IVF procedure. Not only that, regarding donation of gametes and embryos, anonymity is guaranteed within Brazil, except when donated by relatives. And if donated by relatives in Brazil, there's the need for them to be at the most at 4th degree of kinship. Moreover, there could never involve a commercial nature in Brazil. This includes surrogacy. So in Brazil, surrogacy is allowed, but never in a commercial nature. There are restrictions regarding the surrogate mother to belong to the family of one of the parents, either in blood relationship, up to the 4th degree of kinship. So this is something that Brazil has been prescribing. And of course, now there is an obligation that this pregnancy should not be the first of the woman. So it should be, for instance, the 2nd pregnancy or the 3rd pregnancy for her to go through surrogacy. So now let's see what in Brazil has happened during Bolsonaro's mandate. There is a bill in Congress. It was introduced in, reintroduced, in August 2021 that aimed to limit procedures regarding assisted reproduction within Brazil. Although it is an old project of 2003, it was unshelved by the Bolsonaro government in order to try passing this law that would limit the fertilization in vitro processes. For instance, the fertilization could only be of 2 gametes. Today, there's no limit. If you can get, I don't know, 10 eggs, you can have the 10 eggs fertilized, but they would limit only into 2. This would be a huge setback within Brazil, because it is a very costly procedure, and not only costly, but also it would involve making the woman grow more eggs, and then only 2 could be fertilized and the others would be actually destroyed. So it would impair even a possibility for her to have this fertilization, maybe a better rate of success. Not only that, it would prohibit the embryonic biopsy. Today, we have a biopsy allowed for sex verification of diseases linked to sex. And not only that, of alterations of chromosome, but not all IVF procedures go through this biopsy. One should authorize it. Nevertheless, this bill would prohibit this possibility. So for families that had chromosomes alterations, they would not, for instance, get tested if the embryos that were fertilized would actually have this problem too. Not only that, the bill also determines that the eggs must be transferred fresh, prohibiting freezing the embryos or the eggs. And this is also a big issue because when it comes to IVF procedures, normally one frozen the eggs and then have it transferred afterwards. So this would make even another limitation because sometimes even the uterus is not prepared for receiving the embryos or the eggs freshly. And the bill also prohibits surrogacy in Brazil. So even if we're talking about relative, it wouldn't be possible to have surrogacy because of this bill. The only part that I would say it's open to discussion is that it also removes the anonymity of semen and egg donors. Nevertheless, it would act retroactively. It would not act from the bill passing forward. So this would also become some point of challenging within Brazilian law because acting retroactively wouldn't be allowed within Brazilian legislation, although the bill said so. But this bill was not passed still, but it's still under discussion in Brazil. So it's something that we should keep an eye on because it's one of the bad legacies of Bolsonaro's mandate. Another thing that I must say regarding IVF, it's another constitutional amendment bill that is being proposed in Brazil. It's an old project, but it was unshelved in 2020. It's constitutional amendment bill number 181. It introduces in Brazil the idea of the theory of conception, replacing the natalist theory, because in Brazil now we have a theory that says that the rights of one can only be upheld if that person is born, not within the conception. And with this bill, we would be under the conception that the rights would be built. And this would actually terminate procedures of fertilization in vitro, because then you could not have fertilization because it would mean that you were dealing with a live in a petri dish. So this bill would actually terminate all the IVF procedures in Brazil. We would prohibit IVF in Brazil. This bill would say that all the eggs, even that are frozen, should be disposed. So all of those people that have those eggs frozen would have to dispose of them if this bill were to be approved. Not only that, this bill proposes the criminalization of any type of abortion, including in cases of rape, including cases that it brings threat to the life of the mother. So this is also a very problematic bill that is being discussed in Congress still. At last, I would say that something that Bolsonaro left also was that a scenario of violence against women also increased during his term. For you to have an idea, we have a comparison between 2019 and 2020. When it comes to the killing of women, we had a growing number of 22% of the killing of women in less than 1 year that he was in office. Not only that, we have a hotline in Brazil for one to say that you have been through a violence, you have suffered any sort of violence within your life. This is 100, so you dial 100 and you say what's been going on, and then they can send police cars and everything. We have had 27% increase of calls to 180 in 1 year of mandate, of Bolsonaro's mandate. So violence against women indeed increased during his mandate. Not only that, we have found also that there is difficulty, there is challenges for women to coming forward to say that they have been suffering from violence, or even not only violence as abuse, as aggression, but also rape cases. For instance, the number of rape registration within the police decreased 28% in 1 year of Bolsonaro's mandate. But if you think about those numbers that I brought you, that the cases of rape is always something that is very big in Brazil, and the numbers are very indeed high. So we had less than 28% decrease of communications. This is something that we should take into consideration because women feel threatened to say something. Moreover, when it comes to the hotline, we had minus 25% of calls during 1 year. If we come to think about violence or domestic violence or even aggression within the family household, right? So this is something that we should take into consideration. And who are the targets of this violence? We had 61% of victims being Black women. We have 88.8% of cases where the person that committed these cases of violence is the person that lives along with the woman. So we have even the husband or the partner or former partner committing those crimes. We have 70.7% of women who had only at the most formal or basic degree of literacy. I would say they would only go to 8th grade, I would say at the most. So when they have no education, probably they would be more victimized when it comes to violence suffered in the household. And 65.6% of them had their homes as the place of the violence, where they suffered this violence. So these numbers are from 2021. So this is a very impressive when it comes to a comparison during the previous mandates from Dilma Rousseff or even Lula before Dilma. Of course, the pandemic has helped because people were in their homes and becoming in their homes. Violence is more, I would say, more maybe common. But this violent scenario has much to do with Bolsonaro's family treatment of women, because he's always been abusive, he's always been sexist, and he's always been misogynist when it comes to his declaration as president. So violence and abusive using of words has become much popular in Brazil because of that. And another problem is that during his mandate, we had an increased access of guns and ammunition. So this is something that also fomented the violence against women within the household. So this is something that we should take into consideration as well. And this is the final slide before my final considerations. This slide has some numbers, which are the numbers of, for instance, projects that have been funded, public policies that have been funded for the rights of women in Brazil. So in yellow, we have the numbers of 2019, but for the numbers of 2019, the Congress approved it in the year before. So it was approved in 2018 when Michel Temer was still president of Brazil. So this was the numbers of the amount of money that was placed for public policy directed to women and protecting women's rights, 64 million and 184 million into 2 projects. But then when it comes to 2020 and 2021, which are the numbers approved during Bolsonaro's mandates, we can see that this number fell sharply to 70 million, to 3 million, and then to 63 million and 25 million reais when it comes to transferring money to public policies directed to women's rights. So this shows, for instance, those first slides that I showed when it comes to policies directed to distribution of pads, or even talking about the protection of women into hotlines. So this becomes very problematic when you do not have funds distributed for those means. And then this explains a lot why violence towards women has also risen, because if there is no money, there is no policy, and if there's no policy, there's more violence directed against women. But then, as a final note, a lot of scholars have been saying that it will take more than 4 years, which is the period that we have as a president in Brazil. We change presidents in every 4 years. So it will take more than 4 years to rebuild everything that has been proposed or changed within Bolsonaro's mandate in favor to women's rights. So it won't be only in Lula's mandate. Probably we will need another mandate or other 2 mandates in order to get things back in line. But I must say that Bolsonarism, which would be those followers from Bolsonaro, is still very present in Brazil. Many of Bolsonaro's former ministers are now either federal deputies, senators, or governors in Brazil. Those 2 women, Damares Alves, she became a senator, and Teresa Cristina, which was from agriculture, she became a senator too in Brazil, for you to have an idea. Many of those people have now occupy public spaces, so this is very problematic. For you to have an idea, now, March 8th, so 1 week ago, this is the most voted deputy in Brazil, federal deputy, called Nicolas Ferreira. On Women's Day, he made a transphobic speech at the House of Commons in our Congress, and wearing a wig and everything. And now everybody's trying to get him out of Congress to lose his mandate, but still that's something that would not only need judicial decision, but a political decision within the House, which is dominated by Bolsonarisms. So it would be very hard to have that person removed, unfortunately. So I must say that setbacks, a lot of them, perspectives, not so much, because we have a future that we might need a lot of years to get things in line again. And I don't think that only 4 years we can do much, but still, we left the Geneva Consensus. Still, we had now the Superior Court of Justice working in name of women when it comes to secrecy. But those bills, for instance, regarding IVF, they're still on the table. So we need to fight against those. So I would like to thank you again for your time and attention. And thanks again for having me here and listening to me talk about women's rights in Brazil.
I was wondering if you could speak about the feminist movement in Brazil and what this has done to the movement. Has it enlivened it and really given it new energy, or are people too afraid to gather to protest? Like what has been the feminist response?
Mm-hmm. So I will repeat the question for those who...
Oh, no, thank you.
Oh, they can? Okay, great. So, well, feminist movements within these 4 years of Bolsonaro's mandate were at the center of attack, I would say, from not only Bolsonaro, but all of his ministers and all of the congressmen that were elected along with him. For instance, especially regarding Black women's rights in Brazil, we have had many setbacks as well. I did not bring many of those, but information on those, but still numbers of violence against Black women has raised more than double when it comes to those numbers, as we could see, for instance, that percentage when it comes to domestic violence affecting more Black women. It's just a reflection of that. They have been suffering a lot of violence, not only I would say violence when it comes to talking and disorder, but also in terms of aggression as well, physical aggression. So when it comes to feminist groups now in 2023, at least we had some women that were elected. For instance, we had the first trans deputy elected within the federal government. She spoke right after Nicolas Ferreira made that speech, and it was a beautiful speech that she made, trying to say that she's occupying spaces in order to safeguard the rights of other women that could not be there, because Brazil is the country that kills the most of trans in Latin America as a whole. So I would say not only that, but also regarding Black women, we had a lot of Black women being elected for the first time to the federal house. So although Bolsonarism has grew in Brazil, those movements now are getting back together because of these women now being also elected. But they have been suffering a lot of political violence. And as I showed that slide from Marielle Franco, who was killed because of political violence, they have been also suffering a lot of cases of violence, like verbal violence and everything in the House of Congress. So this is something we have also to take care of. But at least now they have a voice. During 4 years, they were mostly silent or silenced, I would say.
Go ahead, yeah. Academics like you, did you feel it in the universities? Did you feel like you could be vocal about the research you were doing, or did you feel like you also had to be careful about what you were doing?
To undergrads, I teach in international relations, and to grad school, I teach in law. To undergrads in international relations, I felt safe, but when it comes to law school, if I taught undergrads in law, it would be a problem, because Uberlândia is in the countryside of Brazil, near a lot of farms, and it is quite Bolsonaro's, let's say, field. So I would be maybe threatened if I taught undergrads there. But in international relations, I felt really fine of talking. Nevertheless, when it comes to other centers, our rectors are appointed by the president. In our federal universities, they're appointed by the president. So we had a lot of interventions in some federal universities. And in those, I had colleagues saying that they would feel silenced because of the rectors. But our rector was re-elected and he's not a Bolsonarist. So this is something that calmed us down. But it depends on the school you are at. At the graduate level, no problem, but undergrad, the problem is bigger, I would say.
I have a question in the chat, and then I'll come back to a live question. From Elizabeth is asking, what can we do to help from here in Canada?
Right. Maybe giving space to people talk about the rights of women and to know what has been going on in Brazil in order to make maybe a public statement or things to get noticed by the government, so that in international meetings, maybe this is something that could be brought. And if this is brought to the, let's say, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something, things might change. So I would say that giving a space or knowing what's going on, this can help too, so that we can fight back those bills that are in Congress right now. International pressure works in Brazil. So international pressure is something. So if you want some money, for instance, for climate change, Brazil probably would have to also give up some of other things that have been discussed internally. So this would be something that would help.
There was a question, and did you hear that? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so Tatiana, congratulations on your work. I'm from Brazil as well. It's really nice to meet you in person after I had the opportunity of reading your work. I believe you presented to us a very terrible political environment under Bolsonaro's rule in Brazil. And I was wondering if you could comment, please, a little bit how this, let us say, political, besides the changing in laws and bylaws and regulations, how this political environment has an influence on courts, on tribunals, in denying women's rights. And perhaps if you could comment as well, how this political environment influences the same thing, but in healthcare, how this create new barriers in healthcare practitioners concerning human rights. Thank you.
Sure. Pleasure to meet you personally too. I would say that during Bolsonaro's term, some judges that are more inclined to the right, they felt safer to give decisions and to render decisions that would put a huge step back on women's rights in Brazil. When I was when I was presenting the numbers regarding abortion and the need to notify, for instance, the police, a doctor to notify the police when a woman would get an abortion. As I said, the only tribunal that would go against that was the State Court of São Paulo. The other state courts would also say that, no, the criminal investigation should go on, this woman committed a crime, and then she should be charged for it. So I would say that during Bolsonaro, judges from the far right and the right felt safer to give decisions that would go in line with Bolsonaro's thought. But when it comes to the political arena and to, for instance, rights of women in general, I would say that, well, the judiciary did not want to go much against Bolsonaro because we had a huge fight between our Supreme Court and the executive branch. So we have been having a competition between branches during these 4 years of mandate. Bolsonaro saying bad things about the Supreme Court telling bad things about Bolsonaro. So I would say that the lower courts did not want to get in the middle of this discussion. So they would just render decisions following the executive branch politics and everything. I would say that many of manifestations and political movements within the 4 years of Bolsonaro have suffered a lot, because sometimes in Brazil you can freely express, but depending on the size of the manifestation, you should get a court order before in order to authorize this public meeting or even this encounter. Nevertheless, it depends on what was the type of the manifestation. There would be more police involved and would be more violence also involved on the part of the police, executive branch, in terms of terminating the manifestation earlier or things like that. So I would say that this is something that has been going on.
I have another chat question, then I'll come back to the question. This is from Rebecca Cook. She says, congratulations on a comprehensive yet sobering presentation. I agree. My question concerns the effectiveness of international norms to improve women's equality. Your explanation of how the concerns of the CEDAW committee were ignored in 2020 was very sobering. Does this mean that Brazil can ignore these CEDAW norms with impunity?
Right. Brazil did not only ignore CEDAW, but it ignored even the periodic review from the Human Rights Committee that we had last year. Brazil did not even defend itself from all the accusations regarding rights that had some setbacks within the past 4 years from the time of the periodic review. The problem is that even the Committee on Women's Rights or even the Committee on Human Rights from the UN, they do not have the force of a court order in order to have Brazil actually change its opinion. It would only get Brazil shamed before the international community, embarrassed before the international community, and that's it. But when it comes to the Geneva Consensus, this was something that they were all suffering, so they would actually get power from each other in order to sustain their practices. But nevertheless, when it comes to courts, international courts, I would say that during the Bolsonaro's mandate, we had a lot of cases brought before the Inter-American System of Human Rights. For instance, now Brazil is pending in 8 cases before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and some of these cases relate to women. One decision I must point that was delivered by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights regards violence against women, and the other one regards violence against vulnerable people, including women in Brazil. This second decision was Fábrica de Fogos, which is firework factory. Maybe the translation is this, against Brazil. This case concerned the death of more than 80 people that were kept in a very vulnerable situation, an economic situation in a city in the countryside of Bahia state called Santo Antônio, the city. And what happened was that the Inter-American Court of Human Rights said that Brazil had a systematic violence against vulnerable people, especially women and children, and that should create public policies in order to fight that. But of course, this decision delivered in the middle of Bolsonaro's term did not turn into public policies being promoted because of that chart that I also showed regarding the reduction of money passed by the federal government in order for policies to fight vulnerability to be upheld. So this is something that Brazil is still working on implementing, the decision of the Inter-American Court, but did not have any positive sides yet. And the other decision regarded the violence committed by a deputy, a state deputy, that killed a woman, but because he had immunity, because he was a deputy for so long, for more than 12 years, he could not be judged when he was still in term. So we needed him to step out of office in order to have him judged. And what happened was that when he was judged, in this case, the crime has passed the possibility of being implemented, right? So we had prescription, I would say. I'm not sure if this would be the correct translation, but we had that timeline of the crime being a problem into the implementation of combating violence against women. Therefore, the Inter-American, in that case was the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, said that Brazil should implement changes in its legislation in order for criminal conducts, common criminal conducts, not to be inserted within the immunity of those congressmen. But still no changes in law when it comes to that. But the Inter-American Commission said Brazil should do that. And well, this is something that is also very interesting. And Brazil accepted the Commission's report. So the case was not brought to the Inter-American Court because Brazil accepted the report. And this is something that we still might see changes, maybe in these 4 years of Lula's term. But I would say if the international level, we would only be embarrassed. At the regional level, we have been having a lot of decisions against Brazil. Nevertheless, the question said, is Brazil impune or right going to impunity? I would say so far it is getting impunity because no changes have been seen when it comes to implementing these decisions either by the Inter-American Commission or the Inter-American Court.
Thank you, Tatiana. I think the last question.
Thank you. First, thank you for your brilliant explanation. I'm also Brazilian. I totally agree with you when you say that probably we will not see much advance in reproductive rights in Brazil in the next 4 years. But from your perspective, do you think it would be the moment for the feminist movements to start pressurizing the government right now that we have someone that might be, that is more open to embrace women's rights in the presidency? And also we have ministries supporting women's rights at this moment.
Right. I would say the problem is that those amendments that are being proposed that limit reproduction are still on the table, but they could be shelved Nevertheless, it does not take the executive branch to shelve them, it takes the legislative branch to do so. The problem is that the legislative branch is dominated by Bolsonarists. So the problem is that even if they pass something, the president could veto, but then the Congress could overturn. So I think the idea is to not have those items discussed or placed into the line of the day. Because if they are discussed, there could be this problem of the president vetoing and then the Congress overturning them. So I would say, just let it be there until we have changes in the Congress again. But again, the problem is that congressmen don't change in every 4 years, they change in every 8 years in Brazil sometimes. So that's why I said, we probably won't see any changes in 4 years. It probably will take more than 4 to rebuild this idea of protecting women and women's rights in Brazil, because we need to change the Congress now that has been dominated by Bolsonarists. And when you say about the feminist movement to take part, I would say that a lot of movements now regarding reproduction right are taking a step, especially in that decision when it comes to the Superior Court of Justice, because that was last week. So we have been having a lot of manifestations this week regarding this topic. And besides, there is a case pending before the Inter-American Court of Human Rights against El Salvador that concerns that. It is the second case against El Salvador that talks about reproductive rights. So it is very interesting because now they're taking this stand, let's say, amicus curiae before the Inter-American Court in order for the Inter-American Court maybe to give a decision that would have this conventional imposition to Brazil, because Brazil is a party to the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights and should follow the prescriptions regarding the American Convention and also the judgments by the Inter-American Court. And there is also a rule from the National Council for Magistrates that stipulates that everything that was prescribed by the Inter-American Court should be followed by our judges. So I would say that this is where feminist groups are moving now when it comes to reproductive rights. If we could not take this to the legislative branch, let's go for the international arena, where we might have this bottom-up approach coming back top-bottom afterwards when it comes to the conventional control.
So that was a very insightful presentation. Like, I had no idea about the situation in Brazil. My question is, I'm a little curious about the role of media in the whole scenario. Like, are they lobbying for human rights, or they are completely controlled by?
Right. First, I would say that some might suggest that the media is also responsible for having Bolsonaro elected in 2018, entering into office in 2019, because they were not satisfied with the Brazilian policy and corruption that was being very, let's say, put forward during Dilma's and afterwards during Temer's, which were the last 2 presidents of Brazil terms, right? So if they were not happy, many people say that the media was also responsible for having Bolsonaro elected because they wanted change. So I would say that this is a problem, because when Bolsonaro entered into office, he was not only fighting with the Supreme Court, he was also fighting against the media, especially because he was attacking journalists, women journalists, when they were covering stories. So I would say that the media had also maybe impacted the way that last election turned out, especially Bolsonaro not being reelected. He is the first president not to be reelected. So this is something that is good because, of course, he's now out, although his ministers are still in the Congress. But when it comes to the media, as you could see, it is highly, the problem with that little girl, 10 years old, that a former Ministry of Human Rights, said that she should not get an abortion, and she intervened. She was the one to say who she was, who her family members were, who her parents or relatives were, what was the hospital that they were in, and what is the responsibility of the media. They should have publicized that, even knowing that that was a 10-year-old girl, because we're not talking about only privacy of a person that is, let's say, 18 years old or 19 years old or older. We're talking about a person that is still a child, right? So I would say that the media also has a part when it comes to vulnerabilizing more girls and women when it comes to violence.
Folks online, if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat as well. I'm keeping my eyes on that. Any other questions or comments in the room?
Chat. Okay, so
Sorry?
I have one.
Yes, please, go ahead.
I have one on the chat, so I thought there was a question there. It's a little bit about the changes in the current context, in the sense that, well, there is a new federal government, and most universities, research intensive in Brazil, are within the federal network. So how do you see this affecting the restructuration of the feminist movement? Trying to look on the bright side of that. So this is something that can be readjusted in a certain way, way faster than 4 years or 8 years. And I think you already mentioned that there is some, for instance, distinctions on how these things may play in the graduate level compared to the undergrad level. So the question would be more on this: how this new change in federal policy and for higher education that have already a little bit of more freedom on the research graduate level, but how do you see this unfolding into the undergrad as well?
Right. For instance, in our LLM program in Brazil, this last class, we had at least 5 students writing on women's rights. So this is something very interesting, because they have not only pointed to the flaws of Bolsonaro's problems and policies, but also on the legislation we now still have enacted, right? So it is very interesting, because academically, we have been having no problem or no impairments when it comes to choosing the line of work or anything like that. When it comes to the undergrad, when I mentioned, for instance, problems regarding where the law school is at, or if the rectors were appointed by Bolsonaro, or if they were, let's say, far right, maybe politically, or if they were not. I would say, for instance, in the university where I got my PhD, the rector's office was invaded last week because they were demanding him to let go, to resign, because he was appointed by Bolsonaro, and he wasn't the person that the community, the university community, would have elected, right? When it comes to other universities, I would say that this is probably something that they will also face, because the university from the South is very big and very, let's say, old when it comes to its formation. So it might have an impact in the newer universities, federal universities that had appointments of rectors by Bolsonaro. But in terms of having research or undergrads that are more far right, it depends on where they are. In the center of Brazil, where I'm at, and even more to the places where they have the big farms and big crops and everything, it's very hard to research on those topics, especially because those people that are also not only appointed, but the faculty itself is formed by people that also believe in that. Because to be appointed a professor in a public university in Brazil, you have to go through a contest. And that contest is formed by a bench of professors, 2 of the university and 1 invited. But are those people from the university who invite the 3rd person, right? So if they are far right, they would invite another far right, and they would only approve a far right person to teach there. So we also have this sort of problems still. But I would say in a democracy, you should have people that believe in everything and not, let's say, transposing the barrier of having another person attacked or a person to be submitted to a case of violence. But there's also limits, right? And I would say that this would be a problem when it comes to this center and region of crops and everything in Brazil. But in the Northeast, they saved us the last election for having Bolsonaro not re-elected. And that's where we have a lot of discussion, for instance, into social vulnerability, not only women, but also of the Black community of quilombolas, which are the original traditional people that came from Africa. So indigenous populations as well. So I would say it depends on where you are within the country. Mm-hmm.
We have a comment and a question online from Tatiana. Brazil needs voices like yours in the country and abroad. Great presentation, thank you. And a second question from Rebecca Cook. The decision of the Superior Court of Justice of March of this year is impressive. Can you give more particulars on this decision? For example, does it give any protections to women seeking health care? If give any protections to women seeking health care if their confidentiality is breached? And do any of the medical ethical codes give women any protections? So what might they be?
Great question. So this case of the Superior Court of Justice in what
Just
was
need to
that?
close the door.
Oh, this door? Okay. So the Superior Court of Justice decision regards a case that was filed, if I'm not mistaken, in 2014 still. But it was concerning a case of a girl of 14 years old that took pills in order to get an abortion. Abortion pills are prohibited in Brazil. They cannot be sold in Brazil. They are forbidden by our FDA. But you can easily buy them online through Amazon, AliExpress, or something, some international website. And she took this pill and she got sick and she went to the doctor, and the doctor asked her typical questions as, okay, were you raped, or what happened? And then she just said, I did not want to have this baby anymore and I took the pill. So this case regards that and regards the possibility of women to have access to those medications, right? But the fact that in 2014, okay, the doctor then notified the police because of that, but there were no rules saying that he should do so or he shouldn't do so, because it was a gray line that Brazil did not have any legislation regarding it. Medical codes would say that ethically, privacy should be upheld, but then we have, on the other hand, that the Constitution of Brazil does not prescribe for the possibility of women to have an abortion if they want to, as freely willing to do so. So because we did not have any legislation on that, the case went forward. And the case was always adjudged and declared as being a possible punishment for the girl who went through this abortion procedure, up to the Superior Court of Justice now in 2023. But the point is that, of course, you cannot argue those orders that were passed by the Ministry of Human Rights in 2020 as a possibility for her to be even, well, let's say, put as a violator of the law, because they were passed after the case has happened. Nevertheless, a lot of cases that happened after 2020, when those orders were enacted saying that doctors should notify the police, were also using the state court's decisions as jurisprudence in order to ratify their line of thought. So judges were using other state courts, not São Paulo, because São Paulo was against it, but other 25 states, the federal district, in order to say, okay, see, all the states are doing so. And if the states are saying that it is okay for the doctor to notify, it wouldn't be a breach of privacy, which is actually prescribed for in the Constitution as a right, as a fundamental human right. But in that specific case, they could do so. But then we had this order saying, yes, they have to. So there were no more gray lines, right? So we say that this Superior Court of Justice decision is very important in order to say, not only those orders are unconstitutional, but every notification made by the doctor would violate the ethical code he went through when he graduated from medical school. So that decision is very important for that. But as I said, it does not go through the importance of legalizing abortion in Brazil, because this would entail a discussion that is prescribed for in the Constitution, and would be the case for the Supreme Court of Justice to talk about or to discuss upon, not the Superior Court. But when it comes to federal legislation, Superior Court can say so. So this decision is very much important, and hopefully now it will have the other state tribunals following it. And then maybe we can have a future that doctors will respect privacy. And this is important also because of those decisions I mentioned for El Salvador. One that we have and one that we are now having discussed, that says privacy should be upheld not only because it is prescribed under the constitutions, but it is also prescribed under the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights. So we have one decision. If we have another decision now, it is open for amicus curiae now, for instance. If you want to file for amicus curiae, you could on that case. And if you do so, the interesting part is that we have a conventional prescription. And if it's a conventional prescription, Brazil would have to follow. So this is the first step in order to get that Ministry of Human Rights order buried, everything.
Any other questions in the room? I might take the opportunity to ask, so maybe the last question. We have about 5-7 minutes left. So some of the constitutional amendments in the legislation that you said are tabled and coming are terrifying. They look even worse maybe than what's happened in the last 4 years. What are the chances that they're going to become, will you have the constitutional amendment or the law will pass, or that they'll be stopped?
Right now, if they were to be voted, I would say they would pass because of the majority of the Congress being not the government one, but Bolsonaro's, which is the opposite side of our Congress. So yes, I would say that we should not put that into discussion right now, because I would say that they have a big chance of passing. And this would mean a huge setbacks on many levels of rights within Brazil. And I would say even unconventional, some of them, particularly the IVF ones. We should take into consideration a decision against Costa Rica, in a case named Artavia Murillo against Costa Rica by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, that said that IVF should be something that the governments could not go against, because it is the preservation of the right to family, which is prescribed under Article 19 of the American Convention of Human Rights. So I would say that if Brazil passes that legislation, we would probably have suits before the Supreme Court saying that those amendments would be unconventional. And the problem is that Supreme Court can take years, decades to judge and declare upon a case. And if we have cases from 2004, 2002 not being still debated by the Supreme Court, I would imagine that this would take longer also to be discussed. So even though unconventional, we might still see those amendments, if passed, still implemented. That's why we should not even discuss about them. Let them be. Maybe in 8 years we can change the Congress and then we can bury them for good.